All right, so now we're going to enter the next section, which is modernity, starting from the time of the Enlightenment in the 1600s. Now, we ended the previous presentation with the implications of pre-modern assumptions about knowledge, which were based on the idea of the form. So the implications were that knowledge was rooted in God, that there was two types of knowledge, the natural version and the revealed version. Natural was accessible to everyone. The revealed was only accessible to Christians. There was this, for the natural side, there was this movement from the physics to the metaphysics, or from the material reality to the immaterial reality. As we studied one, we can perceive or deduce what the other was about, even though we couldn't see it directly. For the revealed side of knowledge, you had the church authority. They were the um, depositors of the revealed knowledge. And lastly, the idea was that there was confidence in your um, conclusions, because what you were in within the learning and the studying and the researching process of trying to understand the world, what you were doing, you were actually tapping into a pre-established form or blueprint. And once you accessed it, you were confident that you had a correct knowledge or understanding of that thing. So all these things were implications of the pre-modern way of thinking about knowledge. Once this collapsed, more or less each one of these components fell apart. So uh, for Aristotelian natural theology, for the natural side, there were several scientific discoveries that started to question the physical or the material aspect of Aristotelian reasoning, which was the source of on which the metaphysical knowledge was based on. So if one didn't if people recognize that one wasn't accurate, then obviously the other one would have problems as well, given that the metaphysics was built on the physics. So you have things like heliocentrism. So people are realizing that it's actually the the planets, including the Earth, that are moving around the sun, as opposed to having the Earth as at the center of everything, the way Aristotle perceived it. Aristotle's theories of motions were brought into question. The idea of how objects fall. He thought that heavier objects would fall faster, and people recognize that no, everything falls at the same rate, and a series of other things like this that brought people to the point of recognizing that Aristotle's process created inaccuracies, and because it created inaccuracies about physical reality, and because Aristotle's process always moved from the physical to the immaterial, then it brought everything, his entire system, into question, and it brought the whole concept of form. Aristotle's holomorphism, that entire way of thinking about reality, it was brought into question as a result. When it comes to church authority, which addressed the second half of knowledge, which had to do with revealed knowledge, you have the Protestant Reformation that brought the entire question of church authority. It brought that into question itself. You have a shift from the authority of the church to the authority of Scripture. So now it's not the church that is the conduit of divine knowledge, but the Scripture. Once the authority of the church was brought into question, you have political realignment that takes place, where all the different nations of Europe that were more or less under the authority of the church now decided to realign with various Protestant segments, and essentially break away from under church control. So the Reformation really is a lot more than just a religious thing. It has a lot to do with politics, a lot to do with economics, and the movement of money among different nations, all those different things. So as these things are changing, the political authority of the church shifts or ends up kind of collapsing, at least in parts of Europe, and this affects everything else in terms of epistemology, because um, the church was viewed originally as the conduit of revealed knowledge. Now, somewhat independent of this, but happening at around the same time, you have the rise of something similar to modern science. So you have a rise in this view that the way we acquire knowledge about the world is through experimentation, as opposed to simply observation. There's a shift in how people view the world as being atomistic and mechanistic. So they start to view the world like a machinery as opposed to being partly material, partly immaterial. And finally, the cornerstone of human knowledge shifts away from God to the self. So by the time of the Enlightenment, you have Descartes, who comes in and introduces this idea. So he starts off at a time of epistemic crisis. So because the Reformation happened, um, multiple nations in Europe are essentially they're choosing sides if they want to remain Catholic or if they want to become Protestant. If they do become Protestant, they have to decide between being Reformed or Calvinistic or being Lutheran. Then you have England that decides to do its own thing. So you have Anglicanism rising there. So all these groups are kind of deciding which way to go. This creates a crisis in authority, because whereas before the church had authority in terms of the revealed aspect of knowledge, especially when it comes to things like ethics, things like the laws of the land were built on some sort of ethical system that was rooted in the church, in church authority and its interpretation of revealed religion. But now you have multiple religion that develop their own view of ethics, and it's hard to know who to trust. And then how do you develop a legal system by which to run your country in a time when you don't know whose authority is correct? Protestants cannot make their decisions regarding, they cannot come to a consensus regarding scriptural interpretation, but scripture is supposed to be the essentially like the conduit or the depository of revealed knowledge. Used to be the church, but now this was shifted to scripture, but people couldn't figure out how to, or couldn't agree on how to interpret scripture. So now it's hard to know. Essentially, the whole authority structure tends to collapse. And not just this, but then you have wars of religion developing where different parts of Europe are fighting with each other, there's wars between Protestants and Catholics, and between different types of Protestants and so on. So at this moment in crisis, you have people like Descartes who are trying to figure out how to develop a stable foundation for human knowledge. And what he does is he begins by essentially deconstructing everything. He's saying, what if everything I think I know is wrong? How do I come to something that's stable, that I know for sure to be correct? So essentially, he realizes that pretty much everything he knows could be questioned. It could be it could be exposed to this severe skeptical process where he says, well, I mean, I don't even know if other people exist, because there could be a demon playing games with my mind, and it could just be a dream or something in my imagination, and I cannot be confident of anything. However, he comes to the conclusion after thinking about this is that the one thing he can be certain of is that he himself exists, because in the very process of doubting everything, he must exist to be able to do that doubting. So he comes here to this idea that at least there's one thing that can be an unquestionable, undoubtable foundation for human knowledge. And from here, this metaphor known as foundationalism develops, where if there is such a thing as an unquestionable foundation, maybe everything else, every other type of knowledge we develop can be built on this, so that way we don't make mistakes by by assuming things that are not true the way people had done in the past. Because at this point in time, people are starting to recognize that there were a lot of problems with the assumptions that people were making in the past. So we need, as a human race, to come up with a system to develop a more trustworthy type of knowledge that than what we had before. So he comes up with this metaphor of foundationalism, where we start with this basic, solid things that cannot be questioned, and we build things slowly on top of that. Another a few years later, we have Immanuel Kant, and what he recognizes in terms of epistemology is that um, uh, because up to that point, people were either rationalists or empiricists, so they thought that knowledge is accessible either by contemplation and by reasoning, while others thought that knowledge was accessible by studying the world through our senses. But Kant introduces this idea that when we study the world through our senses, we don't develop a knowledge of the objects themselves, but this sensory knowledge comes in and becomes a type of perception in our minds, and we develop certain mental constructs, and then we superimpose these mental constructs on the world. So what we're seeing is not the objects themselves, but our own mental imagery of what is there. And essentially, all human knowledge exists through this combination of sensory information that is categorized and developed by the mind. And both of these components are needed for something to qualify as knowledge. So when Kant introduces this idea, then eventually he comes to the conclusion, a conclusion which he calls the death of metaphysics, because if knowledge is contribution of these two components, sensory perception and the mental construct that is developed to synthesize this sensory knowledge, and we don't have sensory access to metaphysics, that means there's no way to have metaphysical knowledge. So essentially, he feels that there's nothing more that can be said about metaphysics after this. Now, these ideas, as science continues to develop, and as people are becoming more and more aware of a certain way to study the world, which is through the scientific method, a synthesis develops between these philosophical elements and the scientific process, and it becomes a very powerful synthesis, because science becomes the process by which you learn. So we have this metaphor of the foundationalist metaphor, where we have some starting foundations for knowledge, and then through the scientific process we continue to build and develop knowledge that way. So this view eventually comes to be known as positivism, where essentially the only real knowledge that we can have is this knowledge that is compiled through the scientific process as we're studying the world and developing our knowledge. Now, the way this approach to knowledge ended up being confirmed wasn't so much through philosophical analysis, where people said, hey, there's this idea of a synthesis between this foundationalist metaphor and the scientific method, building up knowledge on a sort of on this image of a solid foundation. And people, it wasn't so much that people analyzed this philosophically and they said, yeah, this is definitely a sound epistemology, but it was more that this approach or this perspective that was being developed at this time became very successful in its results. So it had like a pragmatic justification. because of the technological advancements that occurred, and scientific and technological advancements that occurred relatively quickly from this point of time forward. Sometimes when I teach science class for younger kids, I use the example and I say to them, what do you think is the fastest way for people to travel back in, let's go back maybe 4,000 years in the past? What do you think is the fastest way from them to get to one place to another? So eventually someone will say, well, probably riding a horse. And that might be something like 30 miles an hour. So people could get from one place to another by just riding a horse as fast as the horse could go. Now, if we go, say, 2,000 years in the future from there, um, how was the fastest way people can go from one place to another? Well, it's still a horse and it's still 30 miles an hour. Then you go another 1,000 years in the future, and it's still 30 miles an hour. You get to somewhere around the 1500s, it's still 30 miles an hour. You get to somewhere around the 1700s, it's still 30 miles an hour. And then you go another 2-3 centuries into the future and you come up to the present, and we ask the question, what is the fastest man-made thing we've got? And we actually have spacecrafts that are traveling through space at 250,000 miles an hour. So the world progressed almost nothing at all for millennia, and then in the last couple of centuries, since the scientific revolution, we've come up to the place where we could have things going through space at those crazy speeds. So this is just an example, a silly illustration, but it shows this idea that there has been tremendous scientific and technological advancement within the past few centuries since this synthesis took place, and science and this sort of positivistic view of philosophy merged together and continued on. So the justification for this wasn't so much based on its philosophical soundness as it was on the fact that it works and it's very successful. And just to use this as a way of example, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the nature of science, of the scientific method. This is how we do it today, so it's more recent. It's not necessarily how it was done back then, but a lot of these components were present early on, and some of them were added as we've developed the capacity to do them. But one of the things about science is that we use a large sample size. So sometimes I compare this with people like, a lot of times people use sort of natural remedies for stuff. And you ask them, how do you know that this works? And they say, well, I got sick and then I took it and I felt better, so it works. So essentially people base their decision just on some random attempt to take it, and then they felt better and they think it works. Whereas scientists will say, no, if this thing really works, we're gonna run it on a large sample size of thousands of people probably, and then we can actually know whether it's working, whether it's good or not. And when they do this experiments, they have a control group. So if they have 10,000 people, then they'll have 5,000 people take whatever medication they're supposed to take, whatever is being studied, whatever if they're doing some kind of remedy that they're studying, 5,000 people will take that, and then 5,000 people will take the placebo. So that will be the control group, which takes a fake pill, which hopefully looks exactly the same and smells and tastes the same, but doesn't have the active ingredients. So we could test if the thing actually works or not. Then these experiments are conducted in what is known as a double-blind format, which is that neither the patients nor the doctors and the people distributing the medicine know who's in which group. So there's no sort of you cannot say it's because of just a mental, like, in your mind that you're taking the right pill, so you get better just because you're taking the right pill, type of thing. And then the distribution is randomized. So, sometimes people mistakenly give the medicine to certain types of people, and they select, there's a certain bias in selection. So because of this, the process is randomized, so nobody knows who gets the right pill and who gets the placebo, and there's no bias in how people are selected there. Then we have a very strict data collection process where everything is recorded, all the symptoms, all the results, everything is kept track of. You run the data through statistical analysis, a very rigorous statistical uh, process that has been well tested and understood. If it turns out that something shows that it actually is, like it actually passes through this process successfully, then you want to try to reproduce it, and other people try to reproduce it elsewhere to make sure that it works under different circumstances and other people have eyes on the process, and they can reproduce it as well. And finally, the results are published in peer review publications where others can examine the whole thing, make sure everything is done correctly, and it could be used for other people studying other things in the future. They could go back to this, and essentially knowledge can accumulate over time. Now, I'm presenting this just as an example of the rigor that exists in the scientific process, which makes it understandable that someone will say, yeah, this is definitely a very different way of knowing, as opposed to simply, just trying to observe things about the natural world and then trying to deduce, things about how it works, trying to deduce things about some immaterial realm that, supposedly exists and all this stuff. So uh, there's a reason why these shifts are taking place. So essentially, the modern way of looking at things is a reaction to the perceived mistakes of pre-modernity. So uh, people are developing this ways of thinking about reality, and this views on epistemology. And while they do have some benefits of their own, they're also things are happening this way also because people are unsatisfied with how things used to be, so they're reacting to that. So there's kind of a pendulum swing where people are moving in this direction because of where things used to be. And what I'm going to argue in this video series is that this was an overcorrection to the mistakes of pre-modernity. And what this did is that it created unrealistic expectations for human knowledge. So um, things were not classified as knowledge unless they followed a very rigid and strict protocol that it was I would say it was unrealistic. And especially in terms of religion, this created or set a very high bar for the epistemology of religion, and made it very difficult to justify religious claims. And as a result, people tended to take one of two approaches, either the fundamentalist approach or the liberal approach. The fundamentalist approach was to say, forget all that stuff. We're just going to believe what we believe, and we don't have to justify ourselves. And essentially, people took themselves out of the academic world. They took themselves out of the world, the intellectual world, the world of the educated world, so to speak, and they've developed a trajectory for Christian theology that essentially wasn't taken seriously by academia. And on the other hand, you have the liberal theology, which more or less embraced all these elements and developed a version of Christianity that was very watered down, and it didn't really seem to have much of a connection with historic Christianity and with apostolic Christianity. And I should add that there was something of a correction to the liberal trajectory in what came to be known as neo-orthodoxy later on with Karl Barth and others. But even that is still reacting to these elements that are part of the overcorrection that took place during modernity. So it's a reaction to some of this philosophical movements that are taking place at this point in history. And all these things, all these elements of the pre-modern way of the modern way of thinking didn't start to really correct themselves until fairly late, fairly recently within the mid 20th century, because of people like Michael Polanyi, and Thomas Kuhn. And we'll discuss this in the video on postmodernity, which is going to be the last video. Now, one of the things that are key here is the rise of atheism at this time. When the Enlightenment first began, the majority of people were deists, but over time, over the next century or so, they tended to switch to and become atheists. And atheism had something of an academic and scientific dominance. So within the world of academia in general, whether it's philosophy or other forms of knowledge, and especially within the scientific community and the philosophy of science, atheists have tended to dominate for much of the 20th century. And because of that, it's important to to spend some time really understanding the way atheists think about epistemology, especially when it comes to the idea of God. So within the atheist mind, the logic goes something like this. Basically, you have this foundationless platform where you say, okay, I'm not going to take anything for granted in terms of knowledge. I'm just going to start with a bare minimum, this very basic foundational beliefs. And then from there, I'm just going to build scientific knowledge. And if anybody has some kind of claim that something exists, then they have a burden of proof to prove to us that that thing exists. And they have to prove it scientifically because that's the only way, that's the only type of evidence that is worth taking seriously. And when you have a claim like the existence of God, which is this essentially massive claim, then you need extraordinary evidence to be able to defend and demonstrate that claim. And again, that evidence has to be scientific evidence. So they've developed this three-pronged, I don't know what you would call a formula, this three-pronged formula for what it takes to have justified belief in God. And because of this, it's essentially very difficult to demonstrate that there's the possibility is there that a God exists. Now, the typical way that people, Christians or other theists, have reacted to this is either to accept this and just say, like, look, I cannot demonstrate God. I take it by faith. I'm not going to try to convince anybody. It's unprovable. So, you just have to believe and that's it. So that's one approach. The other approach is to try to produce proofs of God. And since you can't really produce scientific proof, usually people try to produce philosophical proofs like Aquinas' five proofs and so on. But again, this is already not acceptable to the atheists because they've already said they only accept scientific evidence. So then there's a conflict there because the theists try to argue that philosophical evidence is acceptable while the atheists reject that and so on. So that's another approach to this. And finally, a more recent approach proposed by people like Alvin Plantinga has been to claim that belief in God is properly basic. So it doesn't require evidence. It's something that can be believed apart from any evidence. So that's another approach that people have used. Okay, now I would propose that these three reactions to this formula, this atheist formula, are unnecessary because there's actually a mistake in the logic of the atheists, the way they approach the problem. So the Cartesian formula is that you have this solid foundation because there's an unquestionable premise that I myself as an individual exist. I don't know about anybody else, but I personally exist. So that's the starting foundation. But to get from that foundation to the next level where you could build scientific knowledge, you need to overcome this sort of unprovable layer because any other type of knowledge you claim after that, it can be questioned. Like, for example, if you claim that the world exists, maybe the world is an illusion that somebody's playing on your mind, or maybe you're dreaming, or maybe you're part of a computer simulation or whatever. So there's this unprovable layer, and everybody, including atheists, in order to be able to get to the next step, they have to cross this layer in some way in order to be able to develop their scientific knowledge on the so-called foundation. And the way to do that is by um, essentially accepting a set of properly basic beliefs. And these beliefs are things like the existence of other minds, the existence of the world around them, the reliability of our memories, and things like that. And in order for this to work, the way the atheist addresses it, and it says, like, look, these are there's a very minimalist set of beliefs that all of us have to accept. Whether you're a theist, you're an atheist, you're something else, all of us have to accept this. And essentially, we just need to take this for granted as a sort of brute components of the human knowledge structure. And once we accept this, after that, everything is just pure scientific knowledge, and we don't allow anything else. So we have this very minimalist foundation. Yes, some of it cannot be proven, but we accept this minimalist set of beliefs, and then from then on, we only accept scientific knowledge. But there's a problem with this, because you cannot take this properly basic beliefs as brute facts. Their reality, or assuming them to be real, already assumes that they came to exist in some way. So they need an explanation. In other words, if I exist, there has to be an explanation for why I exist. If other minds exist, there has to be an explanation for that. If the world around us exists, there has to be an explanation for why the world exists. And that explanation is also a properly basic belief. And it is part of this foundational element that everybody's sort of skipping over, because there's no way to prove these components in order to move from this indubitable foundation of Descartes to the place where they could build scientific knowledge. So essentially, that one layer that everybody is having to take for granted, it begs the question of how it came to exist. And there's essentially three hypotheses here. You could argue, like the atheist, that it all developed through natural processes. So essentially, the paradigm or the worldview is known as naturalism. In other words, the world, the universe, everything that exists, it's all material, it's all physical, and it all developed on its own from some type of beginning all the way up to the present. We evolved over millions of years, and we came here, and we're able to look at it and understand it. So that's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that there's a mind, and this mind built everything in some way, or caused everything to exist and made it happen. And in between these two options, there's some in-between layer where you could say there's something that doesn't quite qualify as God on one side, it doesn't quite qualify as natural on the other, maybe like some kind of supernatural force or something else. So there's this other possibility there. So you have these three possible hypotheses, and unless any of them, so for example, since we're talking about atheists, unless atheists can demonstrate the naturalist hypothesis and prove that that is the correct one, the correct explanation for the existence of reality, all these three hypotheses are essentially properly basic as a package, because the explanation for the existence of all these things has to be properly basic as well. So we will, in the next video, I'm going to have a whole video that addresses the atheists of today, because I think addressing that is necessary for an epistemology. Understanding that component is necessary in order to have proper epistemology and to be able to move on to the next section. So the next video is going to be about the atheist epistemology, and then finally we'll have the postmodern epistemology that we're moving towards with this presentation series. But what I'm proposing is that the reasoning structure of the atheist has been developed on a mistake, and the attempts to correct this mistake weren't done in the best way possible. And that explains why we are where we are in today's world, and why atheists sort of dominate academia for a while, but all that stuff isn't quite the way it needs to be. And we'll spend more time on this in the next video.